Rain didn't fall on Incheon that night. It attacked. It came in sideways, slamming against 40-foot glass walls until the whole terminal seemed to shudder with every gust. And somewhere above the chaos, a voice crackled through the speakers one more time, flat and tired. "Attention passengers. Flight 782 to Seoul has been delayed indefinitely due to severe weather." Nobody groaned this time. They were past groaning. A man in a rumpled suit was shouting at a gate agent who had clearly stopped listening an hour ago. A toddler screamed, somewhere near baggage claim, high and raw, the kind of cry that comes from exhaustion, not injury. Two businessmen argued over the last hotel voucher like it was oxygen. Somewhere behind the information desk, a woman in an airline vest pressed both palms flat against the counter and just breathed, like she was trying to keep herself from screaming along with everyone else. The whole terminal had the feel of a pot about to boil over, and nobody with any sense wanted to be near the stove. Except her. Nia Smith sat in the middle of it, calm in a way that looked almost unnatural. Cream sweater, matching pants, a single carry-on resting against her ankle like it had learned, over years of travel, exactly how much space to take up. She folded her boarding pass into a small, precise square and slid it into her palm, something she did without noticing, a habit older than she could name, the kind of small ritual her hands performed whenever her mind got too loud to sit still in. This trip had cost her 3 months of convincing herself she deserved to take it. 3 months of telling herself that a pediatric conference in Seoul wasn't running away from anything. It was just work, just a plane ticket, just 11 days somewhere her ex-fiancé's name wouldn't follow her into every room. And now even the sky seemed determined to test that decision. She exhaled slow, stood, and scanned the row of seats for anywhere to sit. There was exactly one open, beside a man in a navy suit, so sharply tailored it looked like it had been stitched directly onto his shoulders. He hadn't moved in the 15 minutes she'd been watching the chaos unfold. Didn't check his phone, didn't sigh, didn't so much as glance at the departure board, flickering red with delays. His watch caught the fluorescent light every time his wrist shifted, and something about the stillness of him, the way he didn't seem bothered by any of this, like chaos was simply weather he'd learned to stand in, made 3 separate travelers walk right past that open seat like it belonged to someone dangerous. Nia almost walked past it too, but her feet were tired, the terminal was loud, and there wasn't another option. "Is this seat taken?" she asked, polite, already bracing for a grunt or a dismissal. He looked up. For one full second, something in the noise around them seemed to drop out completely. Then he gave a single nod. No. She sat, careful to leave a respectful gap of space between them, and neither of them said another word. Lightning lit the runway outside in a flash of white, and for a breath, the whole terminal looked like a photograph of itself. Neither of them knew it yet, but before the sun came up over Seoul, this quiet stranger in the navy suit would spend more money than most people see in a lifetime, buying out every remaining seat in first class on that delayed flight, for the sole, absurd, unbearable reason that he wasn't ready to stop sitting next to her, and that, somehow, wouldn't even be the strangest thing he'd do for her before this story was over. I want to pause right here, because this is where I always like to bring you in. Welcome to Afro-Korean Drama. Every story on this channel is written and produced from scratch, just for you, just for this space we've built together. Tonight's story is about a man who has spent his whole life buying certainty, and a woman who spent hers learning to survive without it. And what happens when the two of them accidentally teach each other a kind of love neither one thought they were allowed to have? If stories like this, slow burn, cross-cultural, a little dangerous, deeply tender, are your thing, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Go ahead and hit subscribe, and while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from tonight, and what time it is right where you are. I read every single one. Now, let's get back to that storm. Nia hadn't planned on noticing anyone else that night. She had enough going on just keeping herself upright. But 3 rows down, an older black woman sat clutching a phone with a cracked screen, her whole body curled forward like she was trying to physically hold herself together. Her name, Nia would learn a few minutes later, was Miss Odell, 71 years old, on her way to Seoul because her granddaughter had a surgery scheduled for the next morning. A surgery Miss Odell had promised, in a video call weeks earlier, that she would be there for. "I told her I'd be sitting right there in that waiting room," Miss Odell kept saying, half to Nia, half to herself. "I told her Grandma don't break her promises." The airline had put her on standby for a hotel voucher 3 hours ago. There were none left. The last woman at the counter had told her, not unkindly, just tiredly, that there was nothing more they could do tonight. Nia watched her dial a number with shaking hands, watched the call fail, watched the woman press her palm flat against her own chest, like she was trying to keep her heart from climbing out of it. She didn't think about it. She just got up. "Ma'am, can I sit with you a second?" It took 20 minutes. Nia gave up her own hotel voucher, the one she'd been quietly holding on to for herself in case the delay stretched into the next day, and pressed it into Miss Odell's hand before the woman could argue. "Baby, I can't take that from you." "You're not taking it," Nia said. "I'm giving it. There's a difference, and I need you to let me have this one." She bought her a hot meal from the one kiosk still open, found an outlet, and crouched on the floor next to a wall socket in her cream-colored pants, without a second thought, charging the woman's phone until it had enough battery to call her daughter and say, voice breaking with relief, "I'm coming, baby. I promise I'm coming. Tell her grandma's coming." She stayed with her until an airline supervisor finally arranged a room 2 hours later, walked her all the way to the shuttle, and only then let herself sink back into a chair, suddenly aware of how tired her own legs were. She never once looked around to see if anyone was watching. Someone was. From his seat, Ji-hoon watched all of it. The exact posture change when Nia knelt on that floor, the way she never once made it about herself, the small, stubborn kindness of a woman who wasn't performing for anybody, who didn't know she was being watched at all. He had spent almost 30 years around people who calculated the value of every gesture before they made it. Loyalty bought, smiles rented. Even grief, in his world, was sometimes a transaction, weighed and priced before it was ever offered. He watched Nia give away comfort she clearly didn't have extra of, and something in his chest, something he would have said, an hour earlier, didn't exist anymore, turned over, slow and unfamiliar, like a lock that hadn't been touched in years, finally giving a quarter turn. Nobody noticed him watching. That was, after all, exactly how he preferred it. An hour later, the airline made an announcement that sent a fresh wave of groans through the gate. The rescheduled flight the next morning would have almost no first-class availability, and coach was packed to capacity. Nia, resigned, simply nodded to herself and went to find a charging outlet for her own dying phone, quietly accepting a long, cramped flight in economy as just one more inconvenience in a night full of them. She didn't see Ji-hoon disappear. He'd stepped past a bank of shuttered duty-free shops, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and clipped in a way that made the airline's regional director on the other end of the line nearly drop his coffee at 1 a.m. Within 11 minutes, every remaining seat in first class on that aircraft, 6 of them, had been purchased under a shell corporation with a name that meant nothing to anyone at the gate. Within 15, a quiet instruction had gone out to the flight's cabin crew. One passenger, and one passenger only, was to be seated beside Mr. Lee. His head of security, a broad-shouldered man named Yoon Sang-chul, who had worked for the family since before Ji-hoon could shave, watched him make the call and said nothing until it was over. Then, carefully, "Sir, may I ask what this is?" "No," Ji-hoon said. Sang-chul had known him long enough to recognize when a conversation was finished before it started. He said nothing else. But he watched the American woman across the terminal a little longer than usual after that. Her name was already typed into the manifest before she'd even finished charging her phone. She would board tomorrow believing she'd simply gotten lucky. The audience, and only the audience, would know better. Morning came gray and rinsed clean, the storm finally spent. Nia scanned her new boarding pass twice. Old habit, the fear of somehow still missing a flight even with the ticket already in her hand, and felt a flush of disbelief when the gate agent waved her toward the jet bridge reserved for first class. "There must be a mistake," she said. The agent smiled, checked the screen, and shook her head. "No mistake. Seat 2A. 2A was beside him. Ji-hoon didn't look surprised to see her. Of course he wasn't. She, however, spent the first 20 minutes of the flight in a state of quiet, disbelieving gratitude, thanking whatever airline gods had decided to smile on her after the night she'd had. "Small world," she said, settling in, still slightly stunned by the leather seat, the warm towel, the entire absurd upgrade of her circumstances. "Guess the universe felt bad about last night." "Maybe," Ji-hoon said, and something in the way he said it, careful, almost amused, made her look at him a second longer than she meant to. She noticed, before either of them said much else, that he'd been staring at the departure screen replaying on the seat back in front of him for several minutes without actually watching it. Waiting for a flight, she asked lightly, or avoiding one? He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. Maybe both. That was all. But it planted something, a small seed of curiosity she couldn't quite explain to herself. They didn't talk much at first, but somewhere over the Pacific, small conversation turned into something else. She teased him, half serious, about the whole cabin being suspiciously, impossibly empty, except for the two of them. "You know," she said, "for someone who apparently bought out first class, you're not very good at making conversation." He answered without missing a beat, face perfectly straight. "I wasn't buying conversation." She raised an eyebrow. "Then what were you buying?" He looked at her for a beat longer than the question required. "Time." She laughed, assuming it was a joke, some dry deflection, and let it go. Neither of them knew yet how much weight that single word would carry by the end of the story. Hours passed. She told him, without meaning to reveal as much as she did, that she'd learned the hard way to stop expecting people to keep their word. That her last engagement had ended because she'd spent 2 years explaining away red flags she should have run from the first time she saw them. "I promised myself," she said, staring at her own hands. "Never again. Never ignore what's right in front of me again." He told her, in barely more words than that he didn't believe trust really existed, not in any form that lasted. "Everyone wants something," he said. "Eventually you find out what." "Not everyone," she said. "You haven't met the people I have." Neither of them said everything, but something about 30,000 feet made honesty feel safer than it usually did, the way confession sometimes comes easier to strangers, on trains and planes, people who don't expect to see each other again. When turbulence rattled the cabin hard enough to spill her water, Nia gripped the armrest, closed her eyes, and said, dead serious, "Well, if we're going down, at least we'll already know each other's names when we land." Ji-hoon laughed. Not a polite exhale, a real one, short and startled out of him, like his own body hadn't expected it either. 2 rows back, Yoon Sang-chul nearly choked on his coffee. He leaned toward the younger guard beside him and murmured, low enough that only the two of them could hear it, "I've worked for him 8 years. A pause, his eyes still on the back of Ji-hoon's seat. "I've never heard that sound." The younger guard didn't understand what he meant until he saw it for himself an hour later. Ji-hoon, unguarded, actually smiling at something the woman beside him had said, his shoulders loose in a way neither of them had ever seen in 8 years of standing behind him in rooms full of men twice his age. Neither Nia nor Ji-hoon noticed the flight attendant quietly draping a blanket over Nia's shoulders 2 hours later, after she'd drifted off somewhere over the Bering Sea, her head tipping slowly toward the window. When she woke and asked, embarrassed, who'd done it, the attendant only smiled. "The gentleman beside you asked us not to wake you." Ji-hoon said nothing. He was looking out the window like he hadn't heard her at all, though the corner of his jaw had tightened just slightly, the way it did whenever he'd been caught doing something he hadn't meant anyone to see. Seoul greeted them with gray morning light and a line of black SUVs idling at the curb. Nia assumed, reasonably, that they belonged to some visiting government delegation, or maybe a wedding party, something ordinary. She was wrong. The moment Ji-hoon stepped through the terminal doors, the air itself seemed to change temperature. 4 men fell into position around him without a word spoken, moving with the kind of precision that comes only from repetition. From having done this so many times, the choreography no longer needed instruction. Nia barely had time to register the shift before the first shot cracked through the pickup lane. Not a car backfiring, not construction, a real gunshot, close enough that the sound punched straight through her chest and left her ears ringing, screaming, glass shattering somewhere to her left. A woman near the curb, dropping to the ground, covering her head. A body, Ji-hoon's body, closing the distance between them in under a second, his arm locking around her shoulders and folding her down and back, using himself as the wall between her and whatever was happening behind him. "Stay where I can see you," he said, low, and it wasn't a request. She was moving before she understood why, hustled into an armored car with her pulse slamming in her ears, catching only fragments. A guard shouting in Korean into a radio, Ji-hoon's voice cutting through it flat and controlled. The particular kind of calm that only comes from having done this before, from having survived it before. Through the tinted window, she caught one last glimpse of the pickup lane. A man in a dark jacket sprinting away from the chaos, weaving through parked cars, gone before anyone could stop him. By the time the car pulled away, tires screeching onto the expressway, she understood one thing with total clarity. Whoever Lee Ji-hoon was, he was not a businessman who happened to have good security. She sat pressed against the far door, hands shaking in her lap, watching him through the rearview mirror as he spoke in low, rapid Korean to Sang-chul, giving instructions she couldn't follow but could feel the shape of. Names, locations, orders that made the guard beside her sit up straighter. Nobody explained anything to her. Nobody needed to ask if she was frightened. Her whole body was answering that question for her. "Are you hurt?" Ji-hoon asked finally, turning to her, his voice dropping into something gentler than the one he'd just used on the phone. "No," she managed. "Are you?" He didn't answer that directly. "You're safe. That's all that matters right now." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have," he said, and looked back out the window, jaw set, watching the mirrors for a tale that, mercifully, didn't come. Inside the walled compound in the hills above the city, behind gates that looked more like a fortress than a home, Ji-hoon finally told her the truth, because there was no version of tonight where he could avoid it any longer. He wasn't simply the CEO of an investment conglomerate. That was the name on the building, the name on the business cards, the name that appeared in financial newspapers next to photographs of him shaking hands with ministers. The truth sat underneath it, in the part of the city that didn't appear on any map handed to tourists. He led one of Korea's most powerful underground organizations, inherited, not chosen, at 24 years old, when his father was murdered and left him an empire built on decades of favors, fear, and blood he hadn't personally spilled but was, undeniably, responsible for now. Nia sat very still while he said it. Her hands, in her lap, had gone cold. "You should have told me," she said quietly, "before I got on that plane. Before any of this. I know. That gunfire back there, those men were shooting at you. Yes. Everyone I've ever been warned about." She stopped herself, swallowed. "Every single red flag I promised myself I'd stop ignoring. You're all of them at once. The money, the silence, the men who move like they've done this before. All of it." He didn't argue. He didn't try to soften it either. "Yes. Why didn't you just let me sit in economy? Why any of this?" For the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost unsteady answering. "Because for one night, I wanted to be a man on an airplane. Not this." He gestured, barely, at the walls around them, the guards outside the door. "Just a man." She stood, and her voice shook only slightly. "I need to go home." He stood too, though he made no move to block the door. "Nia." She stopped, hand on the frame, not quite able to leave without hearing whatever he was about to say. "My father built this out of survival," he said. "His father before him built it the same way. I was 24 when it became mine, standing in a hospital hallway with blood still on my shirt that wasn't mine, and nobody asked me if I wanted it. They just handed it to me and told me which men to trust and which ones to watch. I have spent 5 years being very good at something I never once chose. That doesn't change what it is." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She waited, but he didn't try to talk her out the door after that, didn't reach for her, didn't do any of the things a man used to getting what he wants might have tried. He simply let her go, jaw tight, hands loose at his sides, watching the space where she'd been standing long after the door had already closed. He didn't stop her, because whatever else Lee Ji-hoon had learned to control in 29 years, money, fear, men twice his age, entire boardrooms with a single sentence, he understood, watching her walk toward that gate, that love wasn't on the list. Love couldn't be forced into staying, so he let her go, and it cost him more than any single decision he'd made since he was 24. She made it as far as the airport lounge before an elderly Korean man in a plain gray coat approached her, introducing himself simply as Grandfather Han, once an advisor to Ji-hoon's father, now retired to quieter work. He asked, gently, if she had 10 minutes before her flight. She almost said no. Something in his face made her sit back down instead. What he told her, over tea poured with slow, deliberate ceremony in a private corner of the lounge, rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. 29 years earlier, he explained, during a violent internal betrayal that nearly destroyed the Lee organization from the inside. A car had gone up in flames on a service road outside Seoul. Inside it, badly injured, had been Ji-hoon's father. An American engineer, working on an infrastructure contract nearby, had seen the wreck, pulled him free with his bare hands, driven him to a hospital under a false name to keep him alive long enough for help to arrive, and vanished before dawn without leaving so much as an address. He'd refused the reward the family tried, for years afterward, to find him and offer. He didn't want anything, Grandfather Han said, which, in our world, made him impossible to repay. A man who wants nothing cannot be bought, cannot be owned. We searched for him for years. We never found him. That man's name, Grandfather Han said quietly, sliding a worn photograph across the table, was Nia's father. Nia stared at the photograph, younger, thinner, standing beside a car she barely remembered from childhood, and felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't realized was still sealed shut. "He never told us any of this," she whispered. "Not once. He just said he worked overseas for a few years, before I was born." "Some men carry their courage quietly," Grandfather Han said. "It sounds as though your father was one of them." "Does Ji-hoon know?" "Not yet. He will. Very soon." Grandfather Han folded his hands. "But I want you to understand something before he does. He did not choose you because of your father. He chose you before he ever knew whose daughter you were. That is the part that matters most." "Why does it matter so much, whether he knew or not?" The old man considered the question with the patience of someone who had spent a long life watching men mistake debts for love. "Because in our world, Miss Smith, gratitude and affection often wear the same clothes, and it becomes very hard, after enough years, to tell them apart. Ji-hoon has spent his whole life surrounded by people who wanted something from his family's name. You are the first person who wanted nothing from it at all, and you did not even know there was a debt to collect." Nia turned the photograph over in her hands, searching her father's young, unfamiliar face for some trace of the man who had taught her to ride a bike, who had never once raised his voice in her presence, who had died 5 years ago without her ever suspecting he'd once pulled a stranger from a burning car on the other side of the world. "He never even hinted," she said, mostly to herself. "Some men," Grandfather Han said gently, "consider silence its own form of honor." Nia sat in that lounge long after her flight had been called, and released without her on it, her father's quiet, self-effacing heroism rearranging itself in her memory into something entirely new, and, underneath it, a fresh and uncomfortable question she couldn't shake. What did it mean that fate, or something like it, had tied her to this family before she was even born? While Nia sat with that revelation, Ji-hoon was learning one of his own, one that had been sitting under the surface of that entire storm-delayed night, waiting to surface. Sang-chul brought him the intelligence himself, face carefully blank in the way it only went when the news underneath it was bad. The flight delay hadn't been only weather. A corrupted executive inside Hyundai Jin's rival syndicate, a man named Kwon, whom Ji-hoon had trusted enough to share flight logistics with for over a year, had manipulated the airport schedule after learning Ji-hoon would be traveling that night, engineering enough chaos at the gate to create the perfect cover for an assassination. The plan had depended on precise timing. Ji-hoon, alone, predictable, isolated in a specific section of the terminal at a specific hour, exactly where he always sat, exactly when he always sat there. "Sit down beside him," Nia had asked a stranger, days ago, 4 words that had shifted Ji-hoon half a terminal away from where the attack had been planned, just long enough to throw the entire operation off its timing. She hadn't saved his life on purpose. She hadn't even known there was a life to save. But Kwon's people didn't know that. To them, a woman who sat beside their target minutes before a failed hit, who then boarded his private cabin the next morning and rode away from an armed attack in his own car, wasn't a coincidence. She was inner circle, a liability, a target in her own right now. Ji-hoon closed his eyes when Sang-chul finished, and for the first time in years, his hands, the hands that never shook, that straightened his watch when he was thinking and nothing more, were not entirely steady. "How long has Kwon had access to my travel logistics?" he asked, quiet, dangerous. 14 months. And no one flagged it. No one had reason to. He's been loyal since your father's time. Ji-hoon opened his eyes. Loyalty that lasted 14 months before it didn't isn't loyalty. It's patience. He stood, straightened his watch out of pure habit, and for once, the gesture didn't calm him at all. Find out who else he's spoken to, and find out exactly how much they know about her. Sangchul hesitated, which was, for a man like him, its own kind of alarm. Sir, if they believe she's inner circle, I know what they believe. The woman who had accidentally kept him alive now needed protecting from the very people who wanted him dead. He found her again at the departure gate. Because of course he found her, security detail be damned, he wasn't about to let her disappear onto a trans-Pacific flight without a fight. He crossed the terminal in long, urgent strides that made Sangchul jog to keep pace, and stopped in front of her before she'd even registered he was there. You can't go home, he said. Not yet. Not like this. Watch me. Nia. I don't want your money, she said, voice cracking on the second word, loud enough that a few travelers glanced over, before looking quickly away. I don't want your power. I don't want the cars, or the men with guns, or the compound on the hill, or any of it. Her eyes filled, and she let them, too tired to fight it. I just wanted the man who laughed with me on that airplane. That's all I wanted, and I don't even know if he's real. Ji-hoon said nothing for a long moment. He's real, he finally said, quiet. He's just buried under a lot of things I didn't choose and can't undo overnight. Then dig him out, she said. Or don't. But I can't be the reason people shoot at you in an airport. I can't live like that. I watched my father. She stopped, thinking of the photograph, of a truth she hadn't told him yet. I don't even know who my father really was anymore. I'm not doing that to myself with you too. She walked through the gate without looking back. Behind her, Sangchul stepped up beside Ji-hoon, watching the space where she'd disappeared. Sir, do we let her board? You don't touch her flight, Ji-hoon said. You don't touch anything about her life. If she wants to be far away from all of this, that's her right, and I won't be the man who takes it from her too. And the threat against her? Ji-hoon was quiet for a long moment, watching the gate close behind the last boarding passenger. Protect her whether she knows it or not. Quietly. She never has to see a single one of you, because for the first time since he was 24 years old, someone had looked directly at the empire he'd inherited and told him, without flinching, that it meant nothing to her at all, and, worse, that it had already cost her something she couldn't get back. What followed wasn't a single dramatic gesture, it was weeks. Quiet, deliberate, dangerous weeks, during which Ji-hoon began the long, methodical work of negotiating peace with rival organizations he'd spent years at war with, starting with Kwan's faction, then working outward, city by city, favor by favor, calling in decades of debts his father had left behind, and using every last one of them to buy something he'd never bought before, an ending. He transferred legitimate holdings into lawful management. He handed control of shipping routes, real estate portfolios, and the seafood export company that had quietly laundered money for a decade into the hands of professional boards with no ties to the old world at all. Piece by piece, he dismantled the machinery that had made him untouchable and, in its own way, unreachable. It cost him allies who called it weakness. It cost him the comfort of certainty he'd built his whole identity around. And it cost him something he would never fully recover from. Choi Dae-sung, the man who had raised him like a second father after his own father's death, the man who had taught him to straighten his tie and read a room and never eat until everyone else had been served, was killed in the retaliation that followed one of those negotiations. Caught in an ambush meant, everyone quietly understood, for Ji-hoon himself. Ji-hoon stood over that casket in a black hanbok, jaw locked, and made a decision that surprised every man in that room who expected him to answer blood with blood. We end it, he said. All of it. Now. Before there's another one of these. It was the closest thing to honoring Dae-sung's memory he knew how to give. Not vengeance, but the promise that no one else's family would bury someone because of a war Ji-hoon had inherited but never chosen to keep fighting. Nia, watching from a careful distance those weeks, said nothing at first. But when Grandfather Han came to her again, this time with a proposal that the foundation she was quietly building in her father's name might accept funding from the newly legitimized businesses Ji-hoon was transferring out of the syndicate's hands, she found herself sitting with a harder question than she expected. It was clean money now, on paper, but it had grown out of soil that wasn't clean at all. She thought of Miss Odell's granddaughter, of the children the foundation could reach, of her father's quiet insistence on doing good, without ever needing credit for it. And she thought, too, of what it would mean to build something meant to honor him using money with blood underneath it, however far underneath. In the end, she didn't decide by accounting for where the money had been. She decided by asking what it would become. Every dollar goes to a child who needs surgery they can't afford, she told Grandfather Han, or it doesn't come near this foundation at all. That's the only condition I need. He didn't do any of it because Nia demanded it. He did it because she had shown him, without ever meaning to, that there was another way to hold a life together, besides gripping it until your knuckles went white. Nia stayed in Seoul through most of it, finishing her conference work by day and watching, from a careful distance, a man slowly disassemble the only life he'd ever known. One gray morning, unable to sleep, she wandered down to the street level of the building, where he'd set up a temporary office, and found him crouched behind a row of shipping crates, tipping careful pieces of fish from a folded paper wrapper onto the pavement, while 4 thin, wary cats circled just out of reach. She stopped, stunned into silence. He heard her before he saw her and went rigid, like a man caught somewhere he had no business being. "Don't tell anyone," he said, not turning around. "Your reputation is safe with me," she said, and came to crouch beside him, close enough that her shoulder nearly brushed his. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since I was a boy." He set down another piece of fish, patient, unhurried, nothing like the man who negotiated ceasefires by phone until 2 in the morning. "My mother used to feed the strays outside our old apartment. After she died, I kept doing it. It's the only thing left in my life that doesn't involve anyone owing anyone else something." Nia watched the smallest of the cats finally creep close enough to eat, and something in her chest eased, just slightly, the first real softness she'd let herself feel toward him since the compound. "You're full of surprises, Lee Ji-hoon. Don't get used to it," he said, but there was no edge in it at all. And for the first time since she'd learned the truth about him, she let herself imagine what a version of his life, without all the rest of it, might actually look like. The formal turning point came weeks later, inside the Lee family's ancestral hall, during a rite held for those the family had lost, including, this year, Choi Dae-sung, Ji-hoon's grandmother, a small, sharp-eyed woman who had outlived 2 generations of men in this business, presided over it with the kind of quiet authority no title could buy. Nia, invited almost as an afterthought, found herself unsure of every gesture, when to bow, when to speak, when to simply stand still and let grief exist in the room without trying to fix it. But something in her rose up that she hadn't expected, the same instinct that had guided her, as a girl, through her own grandmother's funeral back home, where the oldest were served first, and grief was honored, not rushed, and every gesture of care was a form of respect older than words. She bowed when the elders bowed. She waited to be served last, without being told to. When Ji-hoon's grandmother finally looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, there was something in the old woman's eyes that hadn't been there before. "You already knew how to do this," she said afterward, in halting English, to Nia's quiet surprise. "Nobody taught you." "My grandmother taught me," Nia said. "Just not this version of it." The old woman nodded slowly, like something had been settled that no negotiation or apology from Ji-hoon could have settled on its own. It wasn't that Nia could become Korean. It was that some things, respect, grief, the honoring of elders, didn't need translating at all. Later that evening, as the hall emptied and incense smoke thinned toward the rafters, Ji-hoon found Nia sitting alone near the doorway, watching the last of the candles burn down. "She likes you," he said. "That's rarer than you know." "She reminded me of my grandmother," Nia admitted. "The way she watched everyone's hands before she watched their faces. Like she already knew hands tell you more than words do." "What did my hands tell you?" "That first night. In the terminal." Nia considered the question longer than he expected. "That you were used to holding everything together by yourself, and that you were tired of it, even if you'd never admit that to anyone." Ji-hoon looked down at his own hands, turning them over once, as if seeing them for the first time in years. "I'm still tired," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how not to be yet." "Then don't do it by yourself anymore," she said. "That's the whole point of any of this." He didn't answer with words. He reached over, slow enough that she could have pulled away if she wanted to, and laced his fingers through hers, and for the first time since that rainy night in the terminal, neither of them let go first. Months later, Incheon's terminal was calm, no storm rattling the glass, no delayed flights blinking red on the board. Just the ordinary hum of people coming and going, unaware that the woman standing quietly near Gate 14, helping finalize a charitable foundation established in the names of two fathers, one Korean, one American, whose courage had connected two families decades before either of them were born, had once sat in this exact terminal, not knowing her life was about to change. She heard footsteps behind her, familiar ones. She turned, and there he was. No security trailing him, no black cars idling at the curb, no convoy, no watch catching the light like a warning. Just the man from that rainy night, standing there with the same small, rare smile she'd once accidentally taught him how to wear. In his hand, half hidden, a single peppermint candy, the kind his mother used to carry, the kind he still carried, without needing to explain why anymore, because she already knew. He knelt. "That night," he said, "I bought every seat in first class because I wasn't ready for our conversation to end." He paused, and for once in his life, his voice wasn't perfectly composed. "Today, I'm not asking you to stay because I can afford to keep you. I'm asking because I finally became the kind of man worth sitting beside." Nia's eyes filled before she could stop them. She thought back to that early, teasing exchange on the plane. "You're not very good at making conversation for a man who bought out first class." And his flat, serious answer, "I wasn't buying conversation. I was buying time." "You told me you were buying time," she said softly. "I was," he said. "Turns out I was buying the chance to meet the woman I'd spend the rest of my life loving." Around them, the ordinary business of the terminal carried on completely unaware, a family reuniting near the escalators, an announcement calling boarding groups toward a gate 3 numbers down, a child pressing his palm flat against the glass to watch a plane taxi out into gray daylight. None of it paused for them, none of it needed to. The two of them had already survived the version of this place that mattered. She said yes before he'd even finished standing back up, and without quite meaning to, her hand went to her pocket, the same small, folded square of paper she still carried out of habit. A boarding pass from a flight that had already landed months ago, proof that she'd stopped needing to fold anything down small enough to survive. Together, they walked toward a new gate, not as two strangers stranded by a storm, but as two people who had finally found, in each other, the home they didn't know they'd been searching for all along. I wrote this story because I wanted to sit with the idea that real love doesn't need to buy its way into anyone's life. It just needs to show up, consistently, honestly, even when it costs something. Do you think Ji-hoon truly changed, or do you think some part of that world will always be waiting for him? And if you were in Nia's seat that night, red flags and all, would you have made the same choice she did? If stories like this one mean something to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one we tell together.